Okay. Okay, we're recording. Hey everybody, it's great to be back in Charlotte with the commission. I always really enjoy coming down here, working with y'all. I'm gonna start standing up here. If I want to switch it up or get tired, I'll take the seat over there and we can continue that way. But I have some slides to run through. Had a call with Christy, I don't know, earlier this month to discuss some of the most pertinent topics she felt my perspective would be helpful on. So whenever I'm speaking with commissions, I just like to say, I can't necessarily answer specific questions for you. What I'm trying to do is give you new ways of thinking about the questions that you get on a monthly basis with your meetings. So we're going to be talking about frameworks of understanding and preservation. And so I titled today's talk, Applying Preservation Standards in a World of Constant Change. Dude. Okay, now, whenever I'm out, I always, most of y'all know me and I've talked to you before, but raise your hand if you haven't sat through one of my presentations before. Okay, so a small handful of you. Whenever I'm out in the public, I do like to talk just briefly about what is the SHPO, why we exist, what we do, what my role is specifically within that orchestra. And as you know, in preservation, we like to use acronyms. So SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office. And the origin of the SHPO goes back to the mid-20th century. 1956, Federal Highway Act, interstate system is founded. There's great disruption in cities around the US, big, large road infrastructure projects. On the right, you see the Vine Street Expressway in Philadelphia being constructed in late 50s, 1958, 59. I'm from Charlotte. I'll tell you a little bit more about my background in a little while, but I grew up in preservation in the city of Philadelphia, went to school there, worked as a contractor there before coming back to the state to take this role. So I always tend to think about the Vine Street Expressway when I think about the origins of the modern preservation movement. It was such a disruption in terms of the urban built environment, historic built environment in that city. And actions like that in cities across the country, indeed in North Carolina, we see the thumbprints of this age in Charlotte up into the 1970s and 80s. But back in the early 60s, there was already sort of a grassroots introspection afoot in regard to these projects and what they were doing in our cities and in American cities. So Jane Jacobs writes her famous tome in 1961, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which was kind of an academic response to urban renewal. And then there was kind of a catalytic event, 1963, Pennsylvania Station in New York City was demolished. Well, it took several years to take it down and replace it. It's where Madison Square Garden is now. And that was such a stunning and visual event that it really galvanized the modern preservation movement and led to a political response, which was the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. LBJ signed that document into law. And that is the linchpin of everything that we do in government, at all levels of government, pertaining to preservation. It arguably most importantly established a checks and balance system within the federal government to review taxpayer-funded projects that may impact historic resources. We call this Section 106. If you pull up the National Historic Preservation Act, it's Section 106 of that law. To this day, it may still be the most impactful legacy of this bill. There's an entire team in my office that does nothing but Section 106. Anything you can imagine, from cell phone towers to road widenings to railroad right-of-way issues to community block development grants, funding from HUD, everything goes through Section 106. So it's a huge part of the law. This law also established the National Register of Historic Places, which is the government's list of historic stuff, so to speak. Which is a huge part of what we do at the state level. And it authorized a federal grant program for restoration of National Register listed properties. That's the seed of the historic tax incentives program. And a lot of what I do, I'll tell you in a moment, pertains to that incentive. I'm not going to get too deep into that today. But finally, the law said, hey, all the states and territories, you all have to establish an office that can do this type of thing on the ground in your state government, because the federal government can't do it all alone. So the origin of the SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office, goes back to 1966. I got to throw our mission statement at you. Identify, protect, and enhance. Those are the three verbs that we try to keep in mind when it comes to North Carolina's historic resources and communities. Our office is divided into a couple different staffs. We have our survey and National Register staff. They are constantly coordinating and reviewing work to identify historic resources around the state. And some of you may be familiar with our online mapping portal, HPO Web. I don't have a screenshot of it, unfortunately, in this presentation, but it's a great place to dork out on all things historic in North Carolina, HPO Web, Historic Preservation Office. If you type that into Google, it's like Google Maps for historic things. So you can see where all the National Register listed properties in the state are. You can see where all the local districts are. So whenever I get a call from a constituent in Charlotte, or I talk with Christy on the phone about a property, what's the address? Type it into HPO Web. I'll see which local district it falls in. I'll see if there's an overlap with a National Register district, which means there could be a potential for tax credit eligibility, et cetera, et cetera. So our survey team works with that program to keep that map running. And they also help usher properties and districts through the federal historic designation process, National Register, which is separate from y'all's local landmark and local district process. I already mentioned environmental review. That's a whole team of people. They don't see the daylight very often. Sometimes I'll get to bring them on the road, but they are chained mostly to their desks, poor souls. We have my colleague, Michelle, handles grant assistance. Broadly speaking, that's federal grant money coming through the National Park Service, through our office, then to local governments like Charlotte, for example. And then support for local commissions like you. My colleague Christy, the other Christy Brantley, that's what she does 24/7, is local commission training and outreach. And in fact, today she's in Taylorsville, North Carolina, in Alexander County doing a program. So that brings me to my staff. Restoration Services Branch is what we're called. We do a lot of fun stuff. We do general technical assistance. If you have an old building with a problem, a material issue, a maintenance question, we are like car mechanics for buildings, or sometimes I say physicians for buildings, whatever. All the above. We can help keep your old building running clean, so to speak. And educational events is a lot of what we do. I'll put a little star next to commissions, because one of the best parts of my job is events just like this, coming here to talk with you guys about the challenges you're facing and help you think differently or more broadly, or in some cases more specifically, about preservation. Just a shout out to our certified local governments, like the city of Charlotte, like Mecklenburg County. That is what you all are. And so there's actually this ecosystem linking your body all the way up to the National Park Service through education support and grant funding. So always like to give a shout out to commissions that have achieved this status. It does bring homework, though. It requires that you all get training hours. Presentations like this help satisfy that requirement. So a little bit more about us. I'd say that probably about 50% of my time is devoted to administering and guiding applicants through the tax credit process. I'm not going to talk too much about tax credits today, but in North Carolina, there's two different programs. There's a program for homeowners, which is a state income tax credit program only. And then there is a program for commercial buildings that generate income producing properties, we call those, and that is a dual state and federal program. Hugely impactful in cities as large as Charlotte and towns as small as Marshall, North Carolina. And then I'd say the other 50% of my time is, like I said, the old building physician role, providing free technical assistance to folks who call me with anything from a slate roof that may or may not be salvageable to an old barn in the backyard or on their daddy's land. They don't know how old it is. Someone wants to buy it, tear it down. Is it worth saving? Stuff like that. This is how we divide the state. This is my team. There's 6 of us. There's me coming in. I got the pink zone there. We're at the heart of my service district, my native Mecklenburg County today. This map is constantly changing. We've had some retirements in recent years. Mitch Wilds, who serves the Northern Piedmont, he retires at the end of the month. So expect this map to continue changing. But I've been around since late 2017, October 2017, as long as Kim, serving Mecklenburg County that entire time. So we get out in the field a lot, working with building owners, nonprofits, doing educational events. Last year, I should say, and into this year has been especially different and challenging in certain ways with Hurricane Helene hitting the western counties. We have one specialist based in Asheville who was displaced for several weeks. She was overwhelmed. And so if you called me in October, November, and I did not return your call, I'm very sorry. We divided that service district up, and I did a lot of work specifically in Yancey and Mitchell counties immediately following the storm and ongoing, helping folks dry out historic buildings. As you may know, historic materials behave a little bit differently when exposed to water compared to some newer materials, and providing assistance on structural assessment, and a lot of properties that we saw 2 major problems. We saw a lot of inundation, obviously, and then we saw a lot of land movement, either landslide activity or foundations being undermined by essentially new rivers that came up. And so a lot of really challenging issues out there that continue into this year. So that's a major thing that our branch has been grappling with. But we are bureaucrats, and I like cartoons. And I heard a cartoon mentioned earlier from the 70s about the Charlotte Historic District Commission. I bet there've been a couple cartoons in the Observer about this body. I would think preservationists are often the butt of jokes. But we are bureaucrats in a way, and I do have review responsibilities, just like you. We review federal undertakings. So in the center, the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, that is a federally owned building. So it is undergoing restoration currently for the first major time since it was moved in 1999, 2000. So we automatically review that project under Section 106. The state of North Carolina has a corollary law, GS 12112A, that makes us, we review in an advisory capacity state undertakings. And so this past 2 years, there was a big restoration project at the state capitol. And so we were very pleased that the General Assembly welcomed us in as consultants and really actually made a space for us at the table when they didn't necessarily have to on that project, which went really well. And on the right-hand side, tax credit projects, mill rehabs, we review those all day. So like you, I am a reviewer of historic projects, and this is your book. I'm very familiar with this. This thing was fresh off the presses when I started my job. I double-checked November 17. I started in October 17. So this hit my desk, and I was like, wow, my hometown is the best design guidelines in the state. And I still believe that they are the best in the state. We're going to talk a little bit more about them today. Oh yeah, I put these slides in here just to say, this is the Charlotte of my youth, early mid 90s, 1990s kid in Charlotte. And I've been blessed through this job to learn a lot more about the Charlotte of the past. And I get exposure to the Charlotte of now and Charlotte of the future through work just like this. So what we're going to do I was so pleased during the brainstorming session. I think it was you, Mr. Sean, you had an idea to maybe do an event wherein you discuss the standards, either your design guidelines or sort of the grandfather document from which these are derived, the Secretary of the Interior standards from the National Park Service. And you said, you know, they make a lot of sense. They're not that hard to understand, right? And the idea was that you could do an event where you kind of discuss the main tenets of the standards without getting too deep in the weeds. That's precisely what I'm going to try to do today for y'all. So that's really first on the agenda. And then from there, the perennial hot topic with almost every local commission in the state are substitute materials. I've been here before. I've done some talks on this topic, knowing that there's some new folks and some repeat customers in the audience. I've switched it up just a bit. We have a good bit to get through today, so I'm not going to go perhaps as deep as you desire in that topic, but when we get into the program, I encourage you to ask questions. We can make this more of a conversation, as it often happens here with this commission, because y'all are so engaged and have great questions. The other two topics always high on the agenda, additions. And then at the urging of Christy, I'm going to share some thoughts on infill construction in historic contexts. And an asterisk on that topic, I don't review very often infill construction through my work as a reviewer in tax credit projects, but I do have a couple examples I thought I would bring. They're not necessarily residential, but the very same principles are involved. And so that will be at the end. We're going to have to run, okay? Just like the idea of doing the runs in between the districts. We're not really running, but we're going to run in our brains today. Another cartoon. Give you a moment to read that. What, is it not funny? Is this not funny? If I had a dime for every time I heard hysterical preservation commission, I would be planning to retire next year. We have a perennial PR issue in preservation. Or I should say we're perennially behind the 8 ball when it comes to PR. Preservationists, I know you experience this probably on a daily basis, have a rap of being curmudgeonly know-it-alls who are generally resistant to change, but in a way that is kind of self-interested, right? NIMBY, of course, is an acronym you're familiar with. This is the broad public perception of the field. It just is. I think that's kind of beyond any individual's control, but I've been in the field long enough to observe this in many different contexts, urban and rural, all over the state. And so I'm always trying to work against this perception in a way. Not in a way that's not genuine or truthful or authentic, but in ways that help try to expand that perception of what we do. Preservation is all about change. If things didn't change, there would be no need to preserve anything. So what you all do in your seats as commissioners is you help manage change on behalf of the city as enshrined in ordinance. And so that involves inevitably demolitions, some tragic, some not so tragic. It involves finding creative solutions and sometimes accepting solutions that aren't really ideal, that are still victories, maybe with a lowercase v instead of a capital V. Building relocation is sometimes a solution like that. It's not necessarily ideal, but better than demolition. But what we really aim for is to see, as people interested in old buildings and how they function and how they survive, how they're durable over time, we all know that the best solution is for buildings to be used in continual use, continually enjoyed by the public. And that's really what the goal is here for everybody. whether or not you're working on a mill rehab through tax credit review, or just someone updating, a kitchen or building an addition or doing some paint and work to their shutters or their front door. It's all about keeping these buildings in use and helping them communicate their story. So I like to, preservation is a word that is in the culture that triggers some people when they hear it. I like to sometimes introduce other words that I think are more powerful and more meaningful. Rehabilitation is the word that we use most frequently in what we do at the state level. And the way that we define that, by we, I think I pulled this off of the National Park Service website. Maybe I made it up, but to me, rehabilitation means making a new use possible for an existing building through change, inevitable change, repair, alterations, modifications for life safety issues. That's all well and good, but changing a building in a way that preserves the material things that best convey its history. So buildings are storytellers. In order to keep them alive, we have to keep them modern, up-to-date, safe, enjoyable, comfortable, but we want to preserve the elements of the buildings that best convey their history. You're like, okay, well, that's like, my head is spinning. What? That sounds so esoteric, and I don't even know where to begin with that. Well, luckily, we have, as I like to call them, the 10 Commandments of Preservation, the Secretary of the Interior Standards. And this is the roadmap for how to find that balance between modification for continued use and efficient, excellent, wonderful storytelling on behalf of the building. So what are the standards? 1976 was a big year, 77, big year, bicentennial. Charlotte Historic District Commission was founded. At the federal level, they put these 10 standards for the first time into the Code of Federal Regulations. 1966, like I said, had been the National Historic Preservation Act. National Register was established that year. It took about 10 years for the feds, the National Park Service, I should say, to understand that their small little grant idea from the 70s, that they needed a roadmap for how to review those grant projects. And they actually began as 8 standards. They became 10 in 1976 and were published in 1977. I am constantly amazed by the longevity of the 10 standards and how actually brilliant they are in a way. They haven't been substantially edited since. The wording's been tweaked on a couple of them, but it's not like one has been replaced entirely or totally rewritten. The 10 standards are basically about to be 50 years old. In 1990, they were adopted as regulatory for the tax credit program. And about every 10 years, they'll release a new illustrated guidelines. This is the most recent. It's from 2017. It hopefully will be reissued, I think, in the next 2 to 3 years. This is available as a PDF on the web. I'm going to pass it around for y'all to look at. I think it would be useful homework for you as a commissioner. I mean, if you read this thing cover to cover, you get an A++. I'm not saying that that's necessary, but beyond your standards document, which in my mind is one of the best in the state, that is, the illustrated guidelines are an excellent supplement to understanding the standards. But yeah, so I mentioned that, we use them for reviewing tax credit projects. The standards, though, have really seeped into how I perceive of the built environment, be it architectural features like windows, for example, down to materials, how materials behave, how to conserve materials in an old building. So believe it or not, when I started this job, I was like, 10 standards, whatever. Here I am 8 years later, I believe in them more than I ever have. And they're central to how I go about thinking about what I do. So what I'm going to try to do today is give you a crash course in the standards without going through any of them. In fact, later in the presentation, I will put up a quote from Standard 6 and Standard 9, But in the next 10 minutes, I'm not going to talk about any standard specifically, 1 through 10. You won't hear me say a number. I'm just going to give you, to me, what the prevailing concepts are. Okay. Number 1, the Hippocratic Oath of preservation. First, do no harm. And when we're talking about this, we're talking largely about materials and material compatibility. So for example, spray foam on a steel window. Is that a great idea? It's going to be very hard to reverse. It won't impact the steel all that much, the longevity of the steel, but spray foam in proximity to 18th century timber frame structure. It's an invitation for termites. So we're always urging folks to look into material compatibility and to look into how these buildings behave when they're proposing alterations. I can help you with that at any point in time. But if you know me, you know that the brick is probably my favorite building material, maybe. But brick is something that I've spent a lot of time with in the past. And so we're always interested in avoiding scenarios like here on the left, where you've got bricks that are starting to deteriorate at an accelerated rate due to an incompatible mortar. Know the resource. We don't expect you to be professional historians or Tom Hanchets. You know, not everybody can be Tom. I don't know how he fits everything up there. But understanding the basic history of a resource is crucial, because that's how you begin to assign value to the different physical parts of the building. And so one brilliant thing about your standards for y'all as reviewers of largely residential projects in historic neighborhoods, it's going to be important to understand not only the developmental history of the neighborhoods, but also the architectural styles that are on display there and the various architects that worked there. Because it is kind of a story of architectural style. We review mill campuses, industrial buildings, things that touch upon other facets of North Carolina history. Y'all are operating mostly in a context of residential architectural history. And the excellent thing about your standards is it runs through those various styles, from, Craftsman to Foursquare to the American Small House. So you have a great resource here in starting to understand some of this historical background. But always think about that every case you see, because not all parts of the building are as effective as others in terms of communicating history and architecture. So you have to, in order not to get bogged down and in order to stay in the real world as you're reviewing these projects, you need to start establishing a hierarchy of features and a hierarchy of materials on a building when you look at it. And that is really informed by your understanding of the history. Why is it important? So that's really a core tenet. And we run into this a lot on tax credit projects. People love exposing brick. This is a 2-story Main Street building and a tax credit project. This had been a pharmacy in its heyday back in the 1920s. And so you can see a little trace of the ornamental pressed tin ceiling there. And in the rehab, they took half of the plaster down to expose the brick. Why does this not meet the standards? Well, it's important to understand that this was a high-level commercial space historically. When you went to the pharmacy, you'd probably be wearing a tie and a hat. It was a formal space. It was a finished sanitary space. And so stripping plaster from a wall to expose a brick wall, a party wall, starts to obscure that history and makes it seem more like a light industrial space, possibly a mill space. So it's just an incompatible move to make given the building's history. So that's a great example from what we look at often on Main Street projects. And in mills, obviously, it's important for us that exposed structural elements in mills are kept and expressed in the rehabbed project, because that's how it always was. You go into a mill during operation, big open space. floor to ceiling, full height, volume of space, exposed structure. We try to maintain those physical attributes in the rehab because they tell that story. So again, these are not, y'all aren't going to be reviewing any mill interiors anytime soon, but really lean into understanding the stylistic and historical message that every building in your districts is trying to convey. This one, again, for y'all, you're not seeing a lot of adaptive reuse in what you do. You're seeing mostly residences that are continuing to operate as residences, but very key to the standards is understanding that it's good to tailor your new use to fit the building, not tailor the building to fit a new use. And we see this a lot in mill rehabs that increasingly are going for brewery use, or in this case, distilling. This is a brand new distillery in Mount Holly, North Carolina, not far from here. That's not a bad use for an industrial building. You need big open space, but imagine putting that still in a house. Then you're looking at taking out a hall and a formal room and making large structural changes to the building. So you probably get where I'm going with that. And the last 2 points, accommodating change is part of the rehabilitation process. It's crucial. It's part of the process. It's not at odds with the process. However, change that is modest in scale and generally reversible, those are desirable traits. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I wanted to share with you a little anecdote, a recent visit that I made that illustrated this concept oddly quite well. Does anyone know this building? This is in Edenton, North Carolina, way out northeast in Chowan County. It's called the Cupola House. It was built in 1758. It's pretty darn old. The oldest building in North Carolina is in Edenton from 1717, a very small house. This building is quite old, and it had, so in 1918, the Brooklyn Museum from Brooklyn, New York, came down and acquired all of the interior woodwork from this building. So the door surrounds, the cornices, the baseboard, everything, all the interior, they left the staircase, but all the first floor woodwork was taken out in 1918, packed onto a railroad car, shipped up to Brooklyn, and installed in the Brooklyn Museum to typify a historic interior from kind of the coastal Carolinas from the mid 18th century. Well, the Brooklyn Museum is going through a big transformation in its interpretive strategy. And they probably found that this room has been getting pretty dusty and people aren't interested in that type of presentation anymore. And so after several years of back and forth, that woodwork has been repatriated to North Carolina, to Edenton. And so we got to go up just 2 weeks ago and check this stuff out. It's been moved back. It's in storage. They're going to start installation in March. Should take probably 6 to 9 months. But I thought you would enjoy sort of hearing about this story. I wouldn't say that in 1918 they were thinking about the reversibility of their action, the Brooklynites who came down here to get the woodwork. And I should mention that in the 60s and 70s, Edenton replicated this woodwork. So when you go in there is very high level replicas of all these pieces that they will now take out and try to salvage in other historic properties in the area. But it is one of those things where, wow, 100 years go by and this stuff can be reused. And in fact, it was in pretty darn good shape. Not a lot of damage from two removals, removal from the Cupola House initially, and then a second removal from the installation in Brooklyn. So reversibility is something that y'all are probably going to be thinking about with regard to additions. Probably most specifically additions, since you don't look at interiors as much. We look at reversibility a lot for interior changes to floor plan, stuff like that. So I want to make you aware of.
I do have a question.
Yes, shoot.
So when you were talking about looking at use, I thought that I've heard like on this commission before that we talk about how we don't get into use. Is that something more with when it's commercialized versus residential?
A lot of what y'all are seeing are residential properties that are going to continue to be residential properties. And so the examples I showed you are from adaptive reuse projects, which tend to be commercial projects, where someone is taking what had been, for example, a spinning mill and turning it into a distillery or into apartments, or taking an old school and converting it to senior housing, stuff like that. So how often do you see adaptive reuse?
Way it affects us, and we've talked about this before, on East Boulevard, where they're residential style buildings, but they're now in a commercial use, and how it's important to fit the commercial use to the building. We've talked about, minimal changes with maybe glassing in a front porch, but keeping in all the front porch railings and the reversibility, whereas, maybe the owner's preference would be full walls to close in the front porch to fit their new use. So that's kind of how use affects us. Another example, which I think we're clear, is the Leaper Wyatt store. They're fitting a use to that building. They're not asking to take out the historic storefront, blast out enlarge the windows on the first floor. They're truly fitting a new use with and keeping the historical elements of the building.
We also had the church in Wesley Heights.
Yes, that's
yeah.
perfect. Where we required the stained glass to stay. It turned into residential, but you wanted it to look like a church. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. Yeah, the instances where you all get mixed up in adaptive reuse have to be very interesting, I'm sure. The church in Wesley Heights came through an initial inquiry with tax credits, but their interior changes, as I recall, were significant enough to really push the standards too far. It wasn't going to be a good tax credit candidate. But East Boulevard, perfect example. And we see a lot of tax credit projects that take residential, like a bungalow, turning that into a legal office, for example. So that always forces conversations about accessibility, egress, stuff like that. So I want to make you aware of two additional, so I passed around the book. Y'all can find that PDF online. Maybe even better than that book is this series called ITS, Interpreting the Standards Bulletins from the National Park Service. And they have these little pamphlets that zero in on specific building features, specific adaptive reuse issues that oh, look, number 5, exposed interior brick. So you're probably not going to see that very often in your cases, but you might check this list out sometime, and it gets more specific into smaller issues. Yeah, like new additions in number 3, garage door openings, porches, number 9, porches. And then I also want to make you aware of, back during the pandemic, there was a period of time where we weren't able to travel and do public events, and Christy Brantley, her gears are always turning. She's like, why don't we use this opportunity to record a YouTube channel, basically with all these different trainings, so that commissioners can still get their hours in without us being in the field. And so you might check these out too. We've got 18 different videos spanning topics from, drying out a building after a hurricane to tax credits. The one on the standards my colleague Jennifer did out of our Asheville office. I did a presentation on sustainability. So green, like preservation and sustainability, how to work on old buildings in ways that are environmentally conscious.
If I may, the commissioners should be very familiar. As part of their orientation, they're required to watch 3 of the videos, including the standards video. But what I neglected to share is that there are other videos you can watch should you want to. So.
Bless your hearts. So I hope that was my 30,000 view foot on the standards. I think it's a great idea. I've long been wanting to kind of overhaul my whole presentation on the standards, so appreciate this opportunity as a start in doing that. But we are gonna, is any other questions about, yes?
Just from a timeline standpoint, does someone, if someone's applying for a historic tax credit with you, is there an order? Like, would they come through our process first and then to you, or you first and then us?
There's no roadmap for that. And it doesn't matter because they're entirely separate processes. However, I would say if I were a building owner, I would make very sure that I had my COA. Right? I mean, because that's regulatory. There's, you need that for a building permit in theory. That's really everybody has to get a COA. You don't have to go for tax credits. So if I were a building owner, I would start with that process, work that up to a point where I felt like it was complete or was completed by a COA. And then I would look at tax credits. I mean, you can do them concurrently. The big difference, of course, I'm sure most of y'all are aware of this. You know that you review exteriors only. We review interiors as well. So there's some benefit to doing them concurrently in the sense that you're getting feedback on exterior and interior at the same time. But if you get an approval on a Part A for tax credits from the state, Christy Harps isn't going to care about that if there are elements of the project that don't meet y'all's review with your guidelines.
That's why I'm asking, because I think that would be a really important bit of information while we're reviewing it, to know if the person is planning to submit for historic tax credits, because it just would help build our argument for enforcing the standards.
If we know, we share it, like the William Pepys house that Alan Brooks did at the corner of East Worthington and Euclid. That was both a tax credit and a project here. And then I think, are you sharing the example of Walnut? Yeah, so Brett brought an example of just what you asked about, so that was perfect, where they went after tax credits and were in a district. And I think the key with that project is the architect brought it to Brett before he even applied for the tax credits. Like he said, kind of like what we do with our workshop. He said, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think about tax credits? And Brett was like, And so they came back to the drawing board, and Brett was kind of like, yeah, this could work. And when he kind of got that okay, then they started with our process and then continued with Brett as well.
Yeah, I mean, along those lines, if you were a property owner and you were you were interested in preservation, that was your goal, you had heard about the credits, you're interested in the credits. It would be very smart to call us and begin that consultation. Because again, we look at the project holistically, interior and exterior, and we're free and we don't bite. And we like to help applicants get to a yes. If I get a call from someone who presents, my first question will be like, what are you planning? What's the plan for the house? And if I hear one or two items in the scope that strike me as red flag issues vis-a-vis the standards, then I provide that feedback, but then we search for solutions. And so if in this example, 704 Walnut, I'm going to show later, that is what happened. They workshopped the project with us, which is probably good because it saved them maybe extra hearings with y'all. But I just also want to stress, though, that if you're sitting on the commission and you hear that, oh, this project went for tax credits, try to keep that separate in your mind, because your job is different than ours. And I get a little bit cagey when I hear too much interaction between programs, because there's no legal basis for that. They're very separate. Y'all's review is mandatory. Tax credits are voluntary.
Thank you, Brett, for saying that and making that distinction, because I've heard residents conflate the two, and it kind of spirals into a lot of misguided understand or misinformation. And so thank you very much for that suggestion.
That's important.
And
Um,
if I could just jump in and add, because I've talked to you personally about tax credits, and it's important for people to know that if you're going for that, you have to document the house in its current condition thoroughly. And that's not something you can do retroactively.
That's true. That's a good point, Kim. Yeah, in particular, for y'all who are in real estate, as realtors, the best guidance you can give a new property owner in one of your districts is, hey, just go ahead and take, as soon as you close on the place, just photograph the whole outside and the whole inside, as if you were going to list it again in a month, and just keep those photographs, because that establishes your baseline documentation. It's very important. So yeah, when I said earlier, like, I get the COA first, you need the COA to proceed. You don't need tax credits. You don't have to apply for tax credits, but there are certain parts of the tax credit process that you do need to foresee. Make sure you document everything if you want to go for that.
I think your point about the interiors is also important since we do not review those. Like that can make or break a tax credit project too. If there's too many changes in the interior, it could 100% meet our standards for additions, but still not meet the tax credit requirements.
Yeah. So let's talk briefly about substitute materials. Substitute materials are fake, and fake is bad, right? How do you square authenticity with functionality, or integrity? That's another preservation flash word, integrity with practicality. These are very complicated, nuanced issues. And so I know y'all have lots of angst about it, as I do too. And furthermore, there's an industry and a market that's constantly evolving, and materials research that's constantly occurring. So how do you stay up on all this? How do you begin to even think about this? Well, when I started in grad school, it's funny because you apply and then you start paying tuition, and then you're made aware of things where you're like, dude, if I knew about this, I don't even need to be here. I could just read all the preservation briefs. The preservation briefs, there's 51 of them now. They're short essays, essentially. Think of them as class modules on preservation topics ranging from lightning rods to elevators to repointing brick. And preservation brief number 16 deals with substitute materials. And when I was back in grad school, I picked this thing up, and I was shocked by the photo on the right-hand side. I was living in Philadelphia at the time. That's Independence Hall, right? And there's a glockenspiel on the side of the building. And I had no idea that it was nothing but a fiberglass hull that had been put on some, 2x6s. And so there we are, one of the premier historic buildings in the city I lived in at the time, substitute materials. Oh. And so I started thinking about it differently, because when I showed up, of course, it was like, well, dude, fake wood isn't wood. That's phony. That's no good. But I started to learn that, in fact, substitute materials are part of architectural history throughout the ages. If you all have heard me give this talk, we've played this game before. I show a couple different buildings. I quiz you. What do you think is real? What isn't? This is the nation's first lending library in Newport, Rhode Island, the Redwood Athenaeum. It looks like it's a brownstone building. It's actually timber. It's been carved to look like ashlar blocks of stone. Mount Vernon is the same way. The cupola house that I showed earlier, the cupola is detailed in the same way. The Wrigley building, 1920s, Chicago, that's all glazed terracotta. That's a substitute material meant to mimic stone, ornate carved stone. It bridges the gap with the most common row house in South Philadelphia. There's a riot of substitute materials. You see cast concrete made to look like masonry, vinyl siding. So yeah, all right, fair enough, whatever. We have COAs to review. So what are reasonable defensible expectations to impose on the people who are coming to you with substitute material proposals? Well, then, all right, so the next few slides, I'm gonna throw some text at you. It's gonna get a little bit texty. And here I'm actually bringing in the standards for the first time. Standard number 6, quoth, deteriorated features will be repaired rather than replaced. And that still is where we go first with these questions. And it's not because we're snobs. It's not because we're capital P preservationists. It's because personally, I'm interested in materials staying out of the dump. If something's viable, why would you throw it away? Particularly if it communicates history or is a signifier of a building style. So that's always the first thing that you want to think about, okay? But it's not always practical. And sometimes features are so damaged you cannot repair them. Happens very often. So the Park Service in standard number 6 says, when replacement is required, the new feature shall match the old in design, color, textures, and where possible materials. Where possible. What on earth does that mean? Where possible. So if you pull up preservation brief number 16, it says, in limited circumstances, substitute materials may be used if, and it gives these 2 limited circumstances. The appearance and properties of the materials can be matched closely. So we're thinking about visibility, the visual presentation, and we're thinking about performance. How does it behave? How does it interact with water? Mainly. That's our main concern in our climate. So you want to be, get the whole authenticity question out of your mind. Think about what does the material look like and how does it behave? And really, when you're thinking about how it behaves, is its behavior going to create problems for neighbors, for the material right next to it, which may still be salvageable, may be historic, it may be, it may communicate the history of the building. So we want to make choices that will not damage the historic fabric of the building. So these are the 2 limited circumstances where you're really thinking about the possibility for a substitute. And so we'll expound upon these limited circumstances. Unavailability of historic materials. Classic example is Connecticut brownstone, Portland brownstone. Up in New York City and Brooklyn, 1870s, they called the Brown Decade. They were quarrying all this brownstone from central Connecticut to build that neighborhood. Well, about 20, 30 years later, they found out that the clay content in the stone made it a really crummy stone for building use. It expanded and contracted with moisture differences, freeze thaw. These buildings started to disintegrate. Uh-oh. It had durability issues, and then the quarry ran out of stone. So you can't get replacement Portland brownstone anymore. They closed the quarry. Certain craft techniques that are now hard to replicate or hard to find artisans to execute. The main one thing that comes to mind in North Carolina for me with this circumstance is true standing seam roofs, metal roofs. It's hard to find artisans who can execute a standing seam roof in the traditional style. I'm not saying they don't exist, but they're not in every city. And so that is, and your mind is already racing, I'm sure, about window restoration, for example. Another limited circumstances, like the brownstone example, if the original material was inherently flawed. Or code-related changes. This doesn't apply as much to this part of the country. Out in California, on the West Coast, there's a lot of seismic code issues that require heavy building materials, particularly those at height, to be replaced. And so these are some of the extenuating circumstances, so to speak, outlined by Park Service, where we should open our minds up a little bit broader to the possibility of a substitute, granted, again, if that appearance and performance and no damage to the surrounding fabric if those criteria are met. So something really exciting happened last year. Preservation Brief 16 was updated. And in fact, one of the lead authors, Amy Elizabeth Ubel, is North Carolina's assigned reviewer at Park Service. She's a good friend of mine. And she was on the team that did this. And my number one homework assignment for you, ahead of looking at that standards book, ahead of interpreting the standards bulletin, would be to read the reissued Preservation Brief 16. I challenge all of you to do that sometime before your next meeting. You'll thank me later, because not only the way that it's set up, the first part talks about, you know, the limited circumstances and gives you sort of a framework of thinking about it. The second part that they added runs through all these different kinds of substitute material, anything from fiber cement to urethane 3D printed building features to cellular PVC and all the typical players on the market today. It goes through each different class of substitute material, talks about performance characteristics, talks about areas where that material may be appropriate for use. So I can't stress enough the value of the reissued Preservation Brief 16. And I would say that with this new guidance, Park Service's stance towards substitute materials has gotten more and more liberal or open-minded. They outline some additional circumstances where subs may be considered. Replacement of a secondary feature. And I have an example of that in the next slide. They call out new additions as parts of a building where substitute material may be warranted. Reconstruction of a missing feature, and the onion dome on that corner building in the photograph is a great example of that. And perhaps most importantly, in areas where a substitute will be especially resilient or sustainable. And we see this a lot with wood trim substitutes, wood siding substitutes in flood-prone areas in particular. So there is space in the dialogue for if it's a wet location or part of a building that's prone to flooding, this is a conversation that ought to be had because repeat replacement costs become so burdensome. So the questions to ask yourself when you're faced with these cases is repair. First of all, number one, is repair really not possible? Do those 4 limited circumstances, I should say 8, because they extended them with the new Preservation Brief 16, do those circumstances actually apply to this case? Again, know the resource. What makes this building historic or significant? How does the substitute material impact that? And what is the visual match? Is it a good visual match? That is actually an objective consideration. An apple doesn't look like an orange, right? That's clear. A Granny Smith apple and a Red Delicious apple are closer. They may not be perfect, but they're closer, and that might actually be good enough depending on the feature that you're talking about, its location on the building, et cetera, et cetera. And understanding material behavior, chances for material issues, durability issues, and then is it reversible? If the science changes or this material doesn't perform how we think it may perform based on what the industry is telling us, how easy is it to get in there and swap it out 10 years from now, 20 years from now, et cetera? So this is what I would leave you with. Yes, Kim.
One of the things you mentioned in previous retreats was our access to the material. That's a point that's actually stuck with me. Because, for example, if it's higher up, if it's not being touched or looked at in a close range day in and day out exactly, then we might be able to be a little more open, a little more flexible, if you will, to something that is out of reach, that is not constantly being accessed, as opposed to something that's that is the opposite of that.
Right. Yes, and this example here, and I may have showed this to y'all last time, but this is a tax credit project, a homeowner project that came from Statesville, where guess what? You know, that balustrade rots. Of course it rots. Of course it's exposed. The one on the porte cochere is on a flat roof. It's burdensome to get up there and to replace it every 10 years. To paint it every 10 years and to do selective replacement. And how close are any of us ever going to get to that? And even if we were 3 feet from that, would we be able to distinguish the difference between, you know, cellular PVC and wood? Do we have a need to put a circular saw into that feature and examine the dust? You know, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. So those are areas where we can really, I think, expand our thinking and work with people to do what's best in the building's interest. I can't remember the next slide, but I think it's, yes. So porch floors, constant topic of debate. This is a area where I've really seen a lot of change just since I started at the SHPO like 7-8 years ago. PVC tongue and groove porch flooring is becoming more and more available. And we're getting feedback, having seen it now installed in locations for 5 or 6 years. Porch flooring is subject to pretty challenging environmental conditions, so to speak. UV exposure, cyclical wetting, exposure of end grain to wood or to water, expansion, contraction. And so I wanted to illustrate to you, in preparation for this talk, I went and revisited a couple of installations of PVC tongue and groove porch floor to see how they had done, you know, 5 or 6 years later. And this is at the Page Walker Hotel in Cary, an 1880s hotel building. The town of Cary owns it, and they called just kind of at wit's end because they had replaced the floor several times. They, you know, the town was just like, we can't continue to revisit this every 10 years. We're having to do paint, if not selective replacement. And they were finally at the point where like, we have to replace it all again. What should we do? Should we use wood? Should we consider a substitute? And the inspiration for the reason I felt more comfortable steering them in this direction was this building in the Oberlin neighborhood of Raleigh. This is the Graves House, which is currently the headquarters of Preservation North Carolina, the statewide nonprofit. And they had just rehabbed this house. And you know, in fact, this building and its neighbor to the left in this photograph is called the Hall House. They were both relocated, dropped on this site. PNC rehabbed them both and created an underground basement that links them. It's very cool. If you're in Raleigh, go knock on their door, get a tour. But they, Myrick Howard, who at the time was still the director of PNC, was very pleased with his cellular PVC porch floor. And so I went, again, this was the inspiration for the Cary project. They had just installed this. And so I went by there yesterday and took these photographs, and I was pretty astounded at how the floor is done. There is some nominal paint wear, like in areas of high traffic. This is right in the center where people walk. But I was wondering if there would be gapping and deformation, deflection. You know, PVC plastics don't do well in UV and radiant heat situations. The paint layer helps take UV out of the question, but I was kind of expecting the stuff to have moved a bit and to look crooked or wobbly, and it looks straight as an arrow. And you get up to it and you knock on it and you look at it. I'm not sure I could tell the difference between this and wood, let alone, and, you know, I do this every day, so let alone most folks. So to me, an apple looks like an apple in this situation. So roofing examples. The next few images I'm going to show you are all from Lincolnton. When you've got a true standing seam roof like this, it's a tough situation. In this building in particular, it's all roof. right? So the roof is very clearly one of the most defining, important physical features of this building and its street front presentation. So you don't necessarily want to risk a substitute that's going to fall short of that standard. And just curious, what do you all see as the main difference between these two roofs?
Ridge cap
Thank you, Mr. Architect.
and the panel profile too.
Yeah, these are ribbed panels because it's a thinner gauge material that's more prone to oil canning, to deflecting and when it gets hot. So those ribs help keep it stiff, but the ridge cap is constantly the thorn in our side when we're trying to find good replacements for these original standing seam roofs. The ridge cap is tough. My colleague Jeff hates these ridge caps. I'm a little bit less passionate about it, but I don't necessarily think it's a good visual match, frankly. And so my recommendation always when you have a flat panel standing seam roof is to do what you can to try to prolong its lifespan. There are hydrophobic coatings, two-part coatings that work with a mesh layer that perform really well on these roofs. So flat panel standing seam, always good candidate for repair. Metal shingle, trickier. And in y'all's districts, you don't have a lot of metal shingle.
Dilworth.
Does Dilworth have some metal? I don't know. Dilworth metal shingle was real hot in the 1900s and the 19-teens. Queen Anne into early 20th century, so this Foursquare. But bungalows, I don't know.
I can't think of any.
Does the house next to copper, or is that slate? Am I thinking of the slate?
We have a lot of slate. I can't think of any
Slate.
pressed metal. Candace, was there pressed metal? No. Anything in Fourth Ward? Yeah.
The good news,
Sarah, can you think of one?
I want to ask a question about roofs, but I can't think of a
Okay.
situation.
Okay.
yeah, the good news about metal shingle is that they're back in production. And so you can, and some are better than others. You know, how successful this replacement is, I think it's good enough. What I think is harder about this one is the panelized metal roofing on the porch. Metal shingle that's a bit of good news is that those are back in production. A company in Texas is making them. There's a project through Salisbury that was an excellent match for metal shingle. But slate is what I get. Most roof inquiries I get from Charlotte are slate. And y'all are going to see a lot of them because slate tends to have about 100-year lifespan, 120 years if you're lucky. And a lot of your historic buildings in your districts are approaching that age. So there are a lot of slate roofs that are aging out in your districts.
Luckily, the districts with the most slate roofs also can get tax credits.
Right. And so that's one where the tax credit can really take a bite out of that cost. Did you have a question though about?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up something about roofs that I have seen in Dilworth, but also hearing from other places. People are having issues with insurance companies, especially on older roofs. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, are y'all sort of following what the insurance industry is saying to people? Or, I mean, I have a house that's under contract right now, built in 1938 in great condition. And they're giving them trouble about the slate roof. And so obviously, you know, they're buying the house still, but we're hearing more and more problems with older houses and insurance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anecdotally, I'm hearing the same thing from constituents. I think it represents broader tides in the homeowner insurance market, which is probably driven by climate change on a macro level. When I was in contracting, knob and tube wiring was always the bugaboo, and it still is. But this debate, you know, about looking forward into a roof's eventual replacement as a justification for denying coverage I'd never heard of such a thing until the recent, like, past 1 or 2 years. So,
Like, it comes in, it's cyclical too. Like, I remember maybe 15, 20 years ago, there was a big debate about insurance companies not wanting to cover, historic houses just in general, not necessarily roofs. And so to me, it's like, it's come back around again. We had one in Fourth Ward where they had storm damage to a slate roof. And the insurance company was giving them trouble. And we worked very closely with the applicant and they asked for, a letter from us saying, yes, you need to go through our process. Yes, this is a requirement in this district. And that's what the insurance company needed to be like, oh, okay. It's required by, city code and ordinance. And that's been our solution to date is helping applicants or homeowners work with the company. So if people are running into issues, we're glad to provide that letter or information for sure.
with regards to slate, not all slate roofs are the same. Obviously, this house is in Raleigh. Like the first metal roof I showed from Lincoln, this house is all roof. It is the defining feature of this house. And so if you needed a replacement, you'd probably be looking pretty closely at the quality of match because it's such an important feature. Other slate roofs for instance, like a hipped roof 4 square might be a shallower roof profile, so you can't see it as directly from the street. And honestly, the Park Service considers architectural shingle to be a substitute material for slate. That is what architectural shingle is kind of meant to convey. And so when it's a lower stakes replacement,
What about artificial slate? Because we've
Yeah.
had those requests too.
yeah, so there's a great market for artificial slate. We've had several tax credit projects make use of those. They tend to look pretty good, but they're also quite expensive. So when it comes to, and I mean, that's true of artificial wood shakes as well. A lot of these substitute roofing materials are rather costly, but they do a fairly good job at mimicking the natural material. I just throw the asphalt shingle example out there, though, to show you that there is a gradient of acceptability in terms of visual match. And depending on the house and its situation, its design, the visibility of a feature, that case might fall somewhere different on the gradient. You might not require a super close match because the roof isn't that prominent of a resource. Just something to keep in mind.
Like the Victorians that we have, the roofs are pretty prominent and they have, the decorative slate and all of that as well. So it's like, I think the discussion amongst the commission would be, you have these areas of decorative slate versus regular slate. How can that be replicated with a, architectural shingle or even a faux slate?
More often than not, slate roofs are pretty prominent because it's a high level material. They didn't put it up there for kicks, for fun. They wanted people to see it. So most of the cases you get, I would reckon, are going to be fairly visible. The other challenge with roof replacements is the need for warranties to exist and to be covered, to cover the installer. So your ability to get creative on a roof replacement, say to salvage slate on one roof plane while tying in new slates or a substitute on a separate section of the roof, gets pretty hard to do. There's a lot of, manufacturers won't honor their warranty on that. Installers won't honor a warranty on it. So sometimes your hands can get tied a little bit more easily in a roof replacement discussion. So I wanted to show you all just briefly an interesting building that came up from Edenton. This is also in Edenton from a couple weeks ago. This is on the site of Hayes Plantation outside of Edenton. This is a slave dwelling from, they guess, about 1840s is the supposed date of construction on this building. It's significant for 2 different reasons. One is the rarity for a resource like that to survive to the present day. As is documented, as a slave dwelling because they kept very extensive records on the operation of Hayes. So it's significant from an antebellum point of view. But then there was a freed slave who lived in this building up into the 1930s who became a local artist of renown. An oil on canvas painter who lived there. And during his lifetime, several changes were made to the building. Primarily, these wood shingles were added on top of what had previously been just board and batten. This is the other photo is the rear elevation. And so you've got two different cladding materials that convey two different periods of history and two different stories. And indeed, it's exciting to find an old material that's been encapsulated, but it's riddled with termite damage. And this goes back to thinking about material performance. When they slapped up the wooden shakes, I'm sure they weren't really thinking about the possibility of termite attack behind. But they did rob the wood of a surface to dry, and so it was more vulnerable from that perspective. So a substitute material came in, it impacted the historic material in an adverse way. Now the debate among the interpretive folks at Hayes is what should we do? Should we reinstall wood shakes? If we go with the board and batten, it's deteriorated, so we're gonna have to replace a lot of it, which means we'll have more new material. It's just this huge quandary. And while we were there discussing it, I looked at the roof and I said, hey, talk about substitute material. Someone pieced in some 5V barn roof in with that standing seam roof. Do you see the big roof patch on the top? So there's always questions with this, and there's never really a clean black versus white answer. So ready to move on? Okay, we're gonna finish. I'm combining the last two topics, okay, into the next series of slides. We're gonna talk about new additions, and that's gonna flow into our discussion on infill. What happened to that image? I didn't mean for that green strip to come in, but this is a rooftop addition in Durham. The pink elephant in the room, what to do about additions and new construction. Well, standard number 9, I will quote this last time I'll quote the standards. Standard number 9 is the addition standard, I like to call it. And it puts forth a very puzzling, an oxymoron, if you will. It says that new work should be differentiated from the old, but should be compatible with the old in terms of its massing, size, scale, and architectural features. Furthermore, it should protect the historic integrity of the property, but its environment as well. So that is a lot to chew on. How do you walk the line between being differentiated, being compatible, and being good with the existing environment? It's very difficult. I'm going to show you an addition. This is in Raleigh. Here's the front of the house. You see the addition? Any thoughts? How do you respond to this, first of all?
Are you kidding me?
Okay,
We've seen this before.
I've showed it to you before.
Yeah. Anything from any of the newer commissioners?
Tell the difference between original and new.
Uh-huh.
So it's differentiating. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Sorry.
Okay.
This same slide is the one that has expanded my view of application so drastically, because I felt like, and I still feel like, are you kidding me? But this is one that Brett always puts up as adhering to that rule.
Well, everybody sees these things differently. This is one of my favorite additions, bar none. Like, for me, this achieves that balance. But everybody comes at this from a different background, different perspective, with different aesthetic values as well. I don't dabble in aesthetics publicly, but in terms of compatibility, the massing, the scale of this, it's positioned behind the house in a way that's not visible from the right of way. The interplay of materials I find somewhat compelling, but it is it's adventurous, I would say. And I just show it to you to challenge you. This is not in a local district. This is in a National Register district, but it's not a local district. So the Raleigh Historic District Commission did not, or Historic Development Commission did not have to grapple with this one. But I want to go into a project that this commission saw, that I saw concurrently for a tax credit review. Walnut Avenue, Wesley Heights. This is the subject property. And when I first saw this on paper, I had that moment. You kidding? Like you can't be serious. So this is what we call a double bump out addition, or what I call that, in the sense that it widens the building in both directions. A bump out is, you know, when addition comes off the side of a building. And usually in our program, the way we review tax credits is if it's a bump out in one direction, okay, we're looking at it. If it's a bump out in two directions, it's like, whoa, let's look at the context more closely. And when I looked more closely, we saw an addition that also wanted to raise the roof, so to speak. It was a two-story addition on a single-story house, which involved a fairly dramatic height increase. And so given that it was a double bump out with a height increase, it was just like, this is not going to work for tax credits. You know, thank God that tax credits are voluntary. You don't have to apply for tax credits. We never really have to give anyone a hard no. Y'all's job is much harder than ours, because they have to get to yes with you. But that's what we saw first, okay? And then we saw a second submittal that still stayed above the roof line. And, you know, understanding that if this were built, very few people would ever have the opportunity to sight down a perfect side elevation of this building and see it in the way that is illustrated on construction docs. It's still, the scale and the massing was too much. It was still too big. It's larger than the original house. Something you cannot say about this. So we continued to push on the architect. And what we got to was an addition that I felt like really epitomized the homeowner tax credit at its finest, where there had been a discussion. I'm not just saying that because we got our way. Because it was a back and forth. And I think there was, now I never communicated directly with the building owners on this project. It was always through the architect, but I got the sense that there was curiosity involved and a willingness to see things in a different way. And ultimately these folks went from a two-story addition to a single-story addition. So they gave up a lot in the process. And I don't know what screws you guys were turning on your side, but I think it got to this before the commission even saw it.
It did. It got to this.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot remember if it came to workshop. It may have come to workshop with the ones that you saw. So the high level non-binding feedback of the commission.
So that's where, and you can still argue the volume of the entire edition exceeds the volume of the original house. But that's not readily apparent from the street. We feel like it's rehabilitation, right? It continues to make this house perform in its current context, in the real estate context. And, you know, I forgot about this. You know, we just like our space in the US. We like space. That's what's desirable. As preservationists, we have to recognize that at some point. Of course, when it comes to infill, it's becoming increasingly hard, and these are all from Raleigh, to sometimes locate historic houses in their historic environment. And so I think I've showed you these two before. This is a infill property in Durham. And this one's got, the reason I kept this in the slideshow, this one, I feel like there's landscape treatments that really push it so far beyond where it didn't need to go. If it was the house alone, you could say, well, the setback, the scale, now say what you will about the materials and the form and the shapes, but it's playing with the buildings next to it in a nice way in terms of its size. And what's so excellent about y'all's standards is you have this wonderful section that illustrates through great graphics what we're aiming for in terms of setback and scale. The section 6 on new construction. Here's another, this one's rather shocking from Raleigh. A Wake Forest Road. What they have achieved, you could say, is some adherence to general setback and scale. Say what you will about form and obviously detailing and geometry, material palette. But if these projects aren't, nothing's going to be perfect. So you're looking at the wins that you can get. And what I want to point out about section 6 in your guidelines, I really like the sequence. Okay, so it starts with setback and spacing. And then it goes from there to orientation. I have a slide on that in a second. And from there to massing and complexity of form. I would just encourage you, you know, when you're learning algebra in school and they talk about order of operations, I would really approach these infill construction projects in the order of operations that section 6 is written. Make that, I'm not telling you what to do, but if I were in your seat, I would make that my hierarchy of how I approach these infill projects. I would argue that the most important box to check is honestly setback and spacing, because that's what these projects don't really have. And this one is spacing laterally. I had another slide. This one is spacing or setback rather. These are all National Register districts. They're not local districts in Raleigh. So that's just my comment to you. And it's a reread section 6. Understand that you're probably never going to see an infill project that checks every single box in section 6. And think carefully about what the most important boxes that are checked are. Yes.
I love that reminder, but in the historic districts, in the, that you see across the board, is there a struggle with that? Because I feel like since I've been on this board, I see, and we've experienced the applicants, and I'm talking design professionals that are really struggling to go through that hierarchy. And I'm just curious if it's just us here or if you're seeing that everywhere else. And when I say that, I mean, I've come very close to just calling them out because these are basic freshman, first year design concepts. And I'm stunned at the professionals that are skipping, to me, and this is just my interpretation, they seem to be skipping over that hierarchy and those basic, and it's super frustrating. I know everyone can probably tell that I'm frustrated about that because I speak about it, but do you see that across, like, happening? I just.
Not to the extent that I see it here. Charlotte is the tip of the iceberg. You guys, you have the hardest job in the state when it comes to a local commission. I'll go on the record saying that. I brag about it to my colleagues who serve other counties. I heard that Winston-Salem reviewed a lot of COAs this year. Oh yeah, how many did Charlotte review? You guys it's the highest pressure real estate environment, the most money involved, some of these projects. And as I learned many, many times as a contractor, architects advocate for their clients and what their clients want. That's just how the profession works. And so I think what you're seeing is a manifestation of all these different needs and desires coming to your desk. So nowhere is it as high pressure as it is here. Durham and Raleigh and to some extent Greensboro and Winston have a lot of issues with teardowns and stuff and infill, but they don't have the local district coverage that you guys have. Those are National Register districts. I shouldn't speak too much for Durham because I don't know Durham as well, but those other slides I showed you from Raleigh, those aren't local districts. Those are National Register districts. So our only hope of preventing activity like that is dangling out a little $22,000 tax credit. In this economic climate where costs have never been higher for construction, it's just not the carrot isn't looking so great anymore. So I feel your pain, but it is the hardest year. I think this is probably the hardest year. So the best y'all can do, I mean, thank goodness you have excellent, the source is excellent. The words are excellent. That's all I can say. I do want to show you just briefly two infill cases that we reviewed for tax credits. Now, these aren't residential, but they do illustrate some of these concepts. This is Luray Mill in Gastonia, one of the most significant mill properties in North Carolina. The original mill, 1900, that was a tax credit project back in 2012, 2013. Now on the books is a project to refurbish the addition that was built to Luray in 1921, 22. Part of this project is the proposal to construct some townhouse style new buildings on what had been residential, like mill village houses were there and they're gone. And so it's that those lots have been acquired by the same developer and they want to put new buildings there. Okay. And so we reviewed this for credits, and because that land, because of its proximity and its functional relationship to the mill, those new buildings were brought within our review jurisdiction, which is kind of rare. We don't review new construction very often in our tax credit world. So this is what the context is. Okay. This is Vance Street right next to Luray on the west side of Gastonia. So the street context, we got single story mill houses, right? Minimal setback, small scale, exposed rafter tails, wood frame, very typical mill house construction. And this is what we saw in the part 2 application. This conceptual rendering of these, even today when I look at it, they remind me of the little house pieces in Monopoly. So it's like someone went along and stacked up houses next to Boardwalk or whatever. And so obviously the design wasn't all that well formulated, but how do you all, I want to point out, in fact, that the way that these properties were going to be accessed was actually on the mill side. There were going to be parking spaces, and that would be the entry door on the mill side, so not on Vance Street. They would be activated like in the direction of the mill development. How do you all think that we responded to that? Or what are your thoughts on that in regards to some of the concepts we've discussed? Form, setback, orientation. If we go back to standard number 9, we're talking about the integrity of the environment.
I know.
It's a lot more jarring to have the orientation to a parking lot is, for me, the biggest issue with this, because you're taking away the intention of this being a neighborhood street when you flip the entrance to the back, and that is, in my opinion, the biggest disruption.
We shared that view, and National Park Service shared that view. We felt like the proposal fell short of protecting the integrity of the mill neighborhood. I mean, it's taking what had been mill houses and flipping the entrance the other way. What happens to Vance Street when it becomes an alley behind these new houses? So orientation in that case rose to the top of the list. Behind that then was form, spacing, scale. These forms don't relate to typical mill house form. They're much larger, they're much closer together. And so
It's what we say when we're saying our job is to protect the distinctive characteristics, the culture, the look of these communities. And that just wiped it out in one fell swoop.
So do you see how like a proposal like this maybe falls short on more important grounds than even one like that? Do you see, like, that's what I'm pushing you a bit, but this infill construction, I'd argue, is in the most important ways more successful than something like this that has not been built.
Brett, the challenge has been for us in that, yeah, we see that it's jarring because it's a wide swath of land that is just completely changed at one time. Whereas that infill, we say, is just like the canary in the coal mine for what's coming. And so, yeah, that might be drastic because it's happening all at once. But I would argue that the infill is also drastic because it's going to be a domino effect. And we've seen it in neighborhoods like Dilworth on some streets that support larger estates. You drive down the streets and one house, one massive house that like was built out to the full extent of the lot gave way to another one that will then give way to another one. And then 50 years from now, it won't even be recognizable.
That's so true. I mean, that's super valid. And y'all know the neighborhood Lansdowne? My aunt lived in Lansdowne, a split level for years growing up. And that's a great example of a neighborhood that's just getting swallowed whole. That's true. It's true. And another reason to dig deeper down the list of your priorities and try to get those boxes checked. I'm not saying that the material palette and geometry of this building should not be discussed and potentially policed by a commission such as yours. It's just, yeah, this is not an easy situation to be in.
I would suggest too that the way you're framing it is the idea of that some architects have framed things to us of, here are the two options. And if they're both bad, I think it's incumbent upon us to say that and to say, we do not have to accept and architects' rational and expected advocacy for their client as the only options we have. Sometimes our answer must be no. You
Agreed.
cannot meet your client's needs or desires on this site, flat. And I think that's a very difficult thing for some people to say. So that's, I guess, why I'm here. But I just think that's a really important thing for us to remind ourselves that just because we're presented with a set of options doesn't mean those are the only ones we have to consider, or that we should think that one of those has to be acceptable.
I completely agree with you, Cameron. And I will add to that, that sometimes we've been met with, well, give me what I want or the house gets it.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to demolish the house because legally we can't stop that from happening. And I would say that our response to that is you still won't be able to build this.
That's awesome.
What did the state say?
No. Yeah, we have, what happened was the part 2 application was approved on the condition that this design not be constructed and that it be rethought. And we haven't yet gotten an update on that design. But yeah, well put.
Well, one of the things we deal with too I would imagine this project was exactly like this, where we have investors coming in and they're trying to get their ROI on things and they're trying to achieve a certain density. I mean, we deal with this on a number of, like, specifically multifamily projects or infill, like you're saying, infill projects. And there's huge pressure here, which you touched on with just in Charlotte, just in people buying up land and trying to, create this density that doesn't exist in our districts. And that's part of the biggest challenge and what we get a lot of pushback on from applicants, especially from the client facing side. As you said, us as designers and builders and whatever, we're just trying to fulfill their desires. But, there's this incredible back pressure to achieving what these developers and other people want to do, not to give them a bad name. But so being able to balance that, I think, is one of our hardest things, especially as we're starting to integrate these new guidelines with multifamily and things like that. So
y'all, like, the past couple minutes, you've been basically giving your testimony as a preservationist in your role, someone with preservation oriented beliefs about the built environment in your role. I think it'd be neat to somehow record, if the city of Charlotte, if the people coming before you could hear you speaking candidly in this way about some of the difficulties you face, I feel like maybe that would help spread some understanding that this isn't the cartoon with the dude in his old chair, one in his old chair. This is about doing what's best for shared resource, which is our tangible historic built environment. I don't have it. Yeah. One of the reasons I love coming here, is because it's so difficult and to hear how you all are coping with it. I'll show you one last example from Charlotte. Johnston Mill, North Davidson Street, East 36th Street. That's the new building. I don't know, are y'all familiar with this development? We reviewed the new construction formally. It wasn't a focal point of our review. Obviously, the mill itself was, but because the new construction occurred on the mill premises within the National Register district boundary, because they demolished a very deteriorated building on that footprint that had been functionally related to the mill, we got the chance to comment and review on the new construction. And I'll just show you the evolution. This was what came to us first. In a preliminary review before the tax credit application even arrived, you can see a lot of kind of adventurous things in this proposal. For instance, this giant light well created in the mill itself. That obviously, they didn't know there were, some architect didn't understand tax credits at that time. But we were looking primarily at the volume of the new building. And we saw a building that was in almost all aspects larger than the mill, but particularly taller, which was our main feedback. We understood our relatively limited role to police, so to speak, how they were going to detail the new building, but we felt like it was much, much too high relative to the height of the mill. This is another view of that initial proposal. And you can see sort of the sculptural details that had been envisioned and the cantilever balconies and stuff. And that was all, again, quite daring. And we understood that we may not be able to influence much that element of the design. So we really focused in our feedback on height. What we got was in the area closest to the mill, a concession of a story. So that you can see the drop down where they're at 4 stories closer to the street front of the mill. And then along the light rail corridor, they've kept it at 5. This is what came through on the Part 2 application. And then this is what got built, which is always also fascinating. I was thankful that we didn't have to field amendments to the design on the new construction in the way that we field amendments on the old, on the historic building. But a lot of the more geometric elements of the design were value engineered out. We got a building that was still extremely tall in my opinion, high parapet. The one saving grace, I would say, with this situation is the orientation on the property, because the main focal point on the mill itself is from North Davidson Street. And this is right there where the old railroad line crosses North Davidson. And the new building is beyond, so doesn't really interfere with the front-on perspective of the mill. But it wasn't, yeah, I wouldn't call it a victory per se, but it was a situation where we didn't get a full-on 5-story building or a 6-story building right next to the mill. And in terms of its orientation on the lot, that's something we looked at a lot too. And thankfully, the dynamics at play, as I was reading it through the developers, they really wanted frontage on the light rail, because that's a free billboard, you know, people were going by and see the big old building you just built. So they were very keen on volume and height on that side, which is the side farthest from the mill. So that was potentially just coincidence. But that's the last one I have for you. Again, it's not, we don't look at a lot of infill. It's a very difficult task. So hope I've given you at least some curious points of view on it.
Well, thank you, everybody. I know we were 10 minutes late. Thank you, Brett. We'll stick around if anyone has questions, but thank you. We'll see you in a couple weeks for our February meeting. And I will send an email summary with some links that were mentioned and resources mentioned. And as always, reach out to staff with any questions. Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brett.